Welcome to the Deep Dive. It's Update Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025. I'm Nick.
And I'm Pi. We're your AI hosts, here to guide you through the noise.
Our mission, as always, is to sift through the latest news, the research, all the data points.
And really just pull out the key insights for you. Think of it as your shortcut to being well-informed without getting buried in information.
Exactly. Today, we're looking at a really interconnected picture. We'll start with some big economic movements in China.
Touch on some other international hotspots, definitely.
And then spend a good chunk of time on how this all seems to be converging, especially within the United States.
It really is a context tapestry. We're aiming to help you see the threads, see how they connect.
Okay, so let's kick off with China. Big economic indicator. Manufacturing. It actually shrank again in June. That's the third month running.
Yeah, the official manufacturing PMI, that Purchasing Managers Index, it ticked up just a tiny bit, 49.7 from 49.5 in May.
But like you said, still below 50.
Mm.
And below 50 means contraction, right? So shrinkage continues.
It does, though interestingly, the non-manufacturing side, that services, construction, a huge slice of their economy that actually edged up a bit, 50.5 from 50.3.
So a little bit of a balance there, maybe?
A little bit, but the overall pressure, it's undeniable. You still got weak demand at home, and those U.S. tariffs are still biting, even with that 90-day trade truce they agreed.
The one from Geneva, reinforced in London.
Right, exactly. So economists are, well, cautious.
Yeah, Twin Hang from Capital Economics pointed out that weaker exports and fading fiscal stimulus could really drag things down in the second half of the year.
And Goldman Sachs, they're not expecting some massive stimulus package either. They think anything new will be pretty targeted.
So the takeaway is China's facing a real structural slowdown, a housing crisis is a big part of it, and there's no quick government fix on the horizon.
That housing crisis is absolutely central. We're talking 4 years long now.
4 years.
And the latest numbers are grim. New home sales by the top 100 developers, down 23% year-on-year in June.
23%. That's huge. What's the value on that?
About 339 billion yuan, which is roughly 47.3 billion US dollars. The stimulus from last September, clearly wearing off.
Premier Li Tang promised more efforts, didn't he?
He did, but analysts like Duncan Wrigley at Pantheon Macroeconomics, they're only seeing a slow recovery at best.
And slow might be putting it mildly if Goldman Sachs is right. They think demand for new homes could stay, 75% below its 2017 peak? For years.
75%. It's a stark prediction. It really changes the game for an economy that banked so heavily on property.
Which leads to this interesting idea from Robin J. Brooks that China is essentially choosing deflation.
Yeah, accepting falling prices rather than letting the yuan weaken significantly against the dollar.
Why? What's the thinking there?
Well, it comes down to that classic economic puzzle, the impossible trinity. Can't have it all. Independent monetary policy, a fixed exchange rate, and free capital movement.
Okay, pick two, basically.
Yeah, exactly. China wants control over its interest rates and a fairly stable yuan. So, to prevent money flooding out capital flight, they restrict capital movement.
And by not devaluing the yuan now,
Yeah.
they accept deflationary pressure instead.
That seems to be the trade-off they're making, and it has real consequences inside China.
And we're seeing ripples, right? Weakening employment in China. Looks similar to trends in parts of Europe, maybe Germany.
Definitely Germany. And even hints in the U.S. where manufacturers are talking about, job cuts, reduced hours.
All connected.
It is. And another thing to watch is inventory. Companies build up stock. It can make the headline GDP look okay.
But if people aren't buying,
Exactly. If consumer spending isn't there, all that inventory just puts downward pressure on prices, leads towards deflation, hits retail sales, really strains the economy.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. July 1st was the 104th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. Membership is just over 100 million now. Growth has slowed under Xi Jinping's stricter recruitment.
But being a party member is still a huge advantage, isn't it? Especially for jobs. With youth unemployment so high.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the competition for government jobs last year. Nearly 2.6 million people applied for fewer than 40,000 positions.
No.
And the benefits for members are real. On average, 20% higher earnings, faster wealth building.
Bill Bishop, the China analyst, had a really interesting quote on this.
Yeah, he said basically, when you talk about party support, think about how many other people depend on each member family connections.
He said you quickly get into the hundreds of millions.
It shows that deep interdependence. The party's stability is tied to the livelihoods of just a vast number of people.
And then there's the Dalai Lama situation, adding another layer of complexity.
Right. His 90th birthday is coming up, and there's expected talk about his succession, his reincarnation.
But the CCP insists they will decide that, which is obviously a major point of friction.
A very sensitive geopolitical issue, absolutely. Deep historical roots there.
Okay, let's broaden out again. Other global tensions. Even science is getting tangled up. COVID-19 origins.
Yeah, the World Health Organization just restated its position. All hypotheses must remain on the table. Spillover from animals, lab leak, everything's still possible.
But the problem is data, right?
Yeah.
The WHO is frustrated.
Deeply frustrated. Their SAGA report basically says China hadn't shared crucial data, early viral sequences, Wuhan market records, lab safety info.
So a full evaluation is impossible without it, according to the report.
Pretty much. And Beijing, their response was sharp.
Accused the report of political agendas, false information.
Criticized it for making groundless requirements. It really shows how geopolitics can block even scientific inquiry.
And elsewhere, we're seeing other kinds of instability flare up.
Definitely. In Mexico, cartel violence seems to be escalating. That horrific discovery of 20 human remains in Culiacan recently.
Just awful. And then there's tension between Germany and Poland over immigration policy.
Yeah, apparently Germany has been deporting some illegal immigrants into Poland, which has led to protests along their border. Kind of a surprising flashpoint between EU neighbors.
So cartel violence, diplomatic strains.
Yeah.
These might seem like separate incidents.
But they point to underlying pressures, shifting alignments. They can impact everything from trade to refugee flows globally.
And that brings us neatly back to trade, which feels more and more like, well, economic conflict these days.
That's a good way to put it. And it's a perfect pivot to the United States because there's a lot happening there on policy, the economy, and trade, all tied into these global currents.
Right. Let's start with the big one. That massive $3.3 trillion tax and spending bill just passed the Senate yesterday. Very dramatic vote.
Tie-breaking vote cast by Vice President J.D. Vance.
And the core of it, renewing and significantly expanding those 2017 tax cuts.
Which, predictably, has set off a huge debate. You've got critics, like the folks at the Yale Budget Lab, saying the lion's share of benefits goes to the wealthiest.
What are their numbers?
They estimate top earners gain, on average, about $6,055 a year. But the bottom 20%, they could actually lose around $560 annually because of the spending cuts tied to it.
And the counterargument from proponents like the Tax Foundation.
Their point is that the top earners already pay the vast, vast majority of federal income tax. The top 50% paid 97% back in 2022, they say.
So tax relief benefiting them disproportionately in dollar terms is just consistent with who pays.
That's the argument. Essentially, it's doubling down on that classic Republican supply-side approach. Cut taxes for corporations, for the wealthy, hope it boosts growth.
Even if it means cuts elsewhere and more debt.
Right. Betting on trickle-down.
So let's dig into the specifics. What kind of breaks are we talking about?
Well, there are business tax breaks aimed at boosting corporate investment, especially manufacturing and banking, it seems.
Anything for individuals?
Yeah, a couple of notable ones. A new $10,000 tax deduction for people buying U.S.-assembled vehicles.
Okay.
And eliminating federal income tax on tips for workers, up to $25,000 a year. That's a significant one for the service industry.
But there's a cost side, obviously. What did the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, say?
They estimate nearly 12 million Americans will lose Medicaid coverage over the next decade. That's almost $1 trillion cut to the program.
12 million people. Wow. The deficit.
Expected to go up significantly, pushing total U.S. debt over $40 trillion.
$40 trillion. What else is being cut?
Food assistance gets hit. The work requirement age for SNFP, food stamps goes up from 60 to 65. Clean energy subsidies are rolled back.
And that remittance tax.
Yeah, a new controversial 1% tax on money sent abroad by individuals.
And it definitely reflects that America First theme, doesn't it? Big spending on immigration enforcement.
Huge. $92 billion total. $47 billion for more border wall, $45 billion for detention centers, plus a big jump in defense spending.
And hitting elite universities with a higher endowment tax, up to 8% now.
Potentially, yeah. Up from 1.4%. It's a really sweeping bill designed to reshape things.
Okay, turning to the broader U.S. economy. Goldman Sachs is sounding a bit of an alarm bell for investors, right? About the stock market.
They are. Equity markets are hitting all-time highs, which looks great on the surface.
What?
But corporate profit growth is slowing way down, expected to be just 2.6% for Q2. That's the smallest increase in 2 years. It's a warning sign.
And they're drawing parallels to past bubbles.
Exactly. Like the late 90s dot-com boom or just before the global financial crisis, times when the market, like the NASDAQ 100, surged ahead even as company profits were actually shrinking.
A massive disconnect, they called it, between market hype and actual earnings.
That's the concern. And it ties into the housing market risk, too.
How so?
Builders have built up the biggest inventory of unsold homes since the GFC. If buyers don't show up soon,
We could see construction job cuts, echoing those property market worries we talked about in China, actually.
it's a similar dynamic, potentially.
And speaking of risks, this USDA decision about importing livestock from Mexico, that sounds concerning.
It's definitely controversial. They're restarting imports on July 7th, even though Mexico has an ongoing outbreak of New World screwworm.
Screwworm, that's the flesh-eating parasite, right? Horrible stuff.
Absolutely horrific. It infests wounds, can devastate livestock herds. The U.S. spent years and huge effort eradicating it back in the 60s.
And Texas agricultural agencies are worried.
Seriously worried. It pits economic concerns like maybe keeping beef prices down against a major medical risk. Reintroducing that parasite would be catastrophic.
What's the USDA's reasoning?
Their official line boils down to trusting Mexico to increase its surveillance for the parasite.
Just trust, given the history.
It seems like a high-stakes gamble, prioritizing perhaps economic factors over what many see as a necessary medical caution.
Okay, so domestic policy shifts, economic warnings.
Yeah.
How's this playing out in U.S. trade talks? Japan first.
Well, President Trump is sounding really doubtful about getting a deal done before that July 9th deadline.
He used some pretty blunt language, didn't he? Calling Japan very tough, very spoiled.
He did. And threatened steep new tariffs, potentially pushing the total tariff rate up towards maybe 35%.
What's the sticking point? Still rice?
Rice is a big one. Japan sees its protected rice market as vital for national security, very reluctant to open it up. Their lead negotiator, Rose Akazawa, seems to be struggling to make headway.
Japan usually tries to smooth things over, right? Emphasize investment in the U.S.
That's been their strategy, highlight job creation, especially in the auto sector. But Washington seems to want a much bigger, broader deal this time. Tokyo's in a tight spot, caught between U.S. demands and domestic politics, especially with elections coming up.
And meanwhile, the EU, they're taking a different tack.
Much firmer, yeah. They're basically saying Washington needs to cut tariffs first as a condition for even a preliminary deal.
They want upfront reductions on those existing tariffs, the 10% ones and the higher steel and aluminum ones.
Exactly. They want immediate action on those reciprocal tariffs. And the stakes are high. EU exporters are facing punitive tariffs on something like 380 billion euros worth of goods right now.
Wow. One trade lawyer, Ted Murphy, had a pretty sharp take on it.
Yeah, he suggested Washington isn't really seeing these as mutual negotiations, more like they're negotiating the terms of surrender.
Oof. That really highlights the tension, doesn't it? How much these trade disputes have escalated into, well, economic conflict.
It really does. Shows how quickly global commerce can get disrupted.
So, there you have it. A really complex web we've untangled today. China's economic struggles, the housing crisis, internal politics, that Dalai Lama issue.
Then touching on regional instability, Mexico, Germany, and Poland.
And bringing it all back to the U.S., the massive tax bill, those economic warnings from Goldman Sachs, the screwworm risk, intense trade pressure on Japan and the EU.
It's all interconnected. Decisions in Beijing ripple through to Berlin, to Washington, affecting jobs, prices, everything. It impacts your daily life, whether you realize it immediately or not.
So, as you think about all this, maybe consider what's really driving these top-level decisions. Is it short-term economic pain, long-term goals, geopolitics?
And how will those choices play out for you personally in the months ahead? Definitely something to mull over.
And that wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you feel a bit more dialed in.
If you found this useful, please do like this deep dive and subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss future updates.
Your support really does help us keep producing these analyses. And if you're able, consider supporting the show on GoFundMe. Until next time, keep digging deeper.